If you don't evolve your thinking and you don't evolve your approach, you're even more out of step with what it takes to inspire and to motivate tomorrow's generation of leaders, to build the type of organizations that young people in particular, and post-pandemic people, by the way, want to work at.
If you're leading yourself, there's a place in everywhere, in everything, as opposed to this mindset or difference like, oh, there's a flip of the switch when all of a sudden you become a leader. It doesn't happen that way, ever.
Every interaction that we have is, do we want to show up as leaders or do we want to show up for ourselves? To me, those are two entirely different things. I think leadership done at its best recognizes and reconciles that paradox. It's not about you when it comes to aspiration, but it's all about you when it comes to taking action.
Welcome to the Tyler Dickerhoof Show with your host, me, Tyler Dickerhoof. On today's episode, I have Matt Poepsel. Matt is an author, a podcaster, a veteran as a Marine Corps. He also faculty at Boston College. He has an entire, I would say, enlightened version of leadership that I'm excited to talk to him today. Both of the origins, what he has himself experienced, but also the origins of that wisdom he has to share. Matt, thanks for being here on the podcast.
Tyler's my honor. Thanks for having me.
Let's go into this first. Marine Corps. All right. Why and what did you learn?
I heard they were the toughest. When I was a kid, about fifth grade, I decided that's something that I wanted to do. And when I got there, I said, well, what's the toughest part of this? And they said, you got to go recon. I said, okay, let's jump out of planes. Let's do some boat stuff. And I just kind of constantly look for that. And what I really learned was how much investment that the Marines in particular put into leadership. And I thought, this was my first adult job. This must be what all adults do. And it wasn't until I separated from the military service that I realized that not every civilian job teaches us all the things we need to know about leadership.
So let me, again, we have such a world. You and I kind of talked a little bit about this, where in today's world, we have this massive upheaval in what is leadership, what should it be? And I think one of the origins, and I love kind of this conversation, is for much of our, I would say, industrialized world, post, the World War II, we now have factories, we have all of it. This idea of what leadership was the general, the whatever, the core, the colonel, on down the list. This is what leadership looks like. And we've kind of held on to that in the world. How would you say your experience in the Marine Corps, but then also everything that you've learned in your ancient, writings, reading ancient writings, how the conflict and or say, oh, maybe it's not what we thought it should be?
Yeah, I think there's a misnomer sometimes when we think about military organizations that they're these big hierarchical, very tall org chart type situations. But in reality, the nature of warfare has changed completely. And now it's much more dynamic. It's much more like Stanley McChrystal wrote about team of teams. And it's a much more fluid environment. So the old models didn't work. So the military updated itself. We don't think of them that way because we're not in it, but that's absolutely what happened. And inside of organizations, then there's this similar notion that the management techniques and what we call leadership and the way we look at org charts, that's not how work actually gets done. It's much more about influence, collaboration, communication, persuasion, these types of things than you could ever really find and point at something to say, here's how we approach our work. So it was clear to me that while the operating environment that we're in has continued to evolve, leadership absolutely has not. So when you think about the way that, as we've been talking about work, what aspect of work today is the same as it was even 10 years ago, much less 20, 30, 40 years ago? And the answer is not much. Everything is highly virtualized, it's federated, there's all kinds of use of outsourcers or what I call the liquid labor market now. All these types of things have all changed. And at the same time, as humans, we've continued to evolve too. We're not happy and satisfied just to have a job and work 9 to 5, and those days are over. And so it really comes down to if we have to do business the way that business is being done. And ultimately, it means that we need an entirely new form of leadership.
One of the things that I rattling in my brain as you were sharing that, we think about leaders today in organizations, and, there's a few that are your age, my age, and younger, mid-50s and younger. There's CEOs, executives. There's a lot of them that are 55 to 60 to 70 to 80, still the face, the lead, everything in their organization. When I think back, and again, I don't want to belabor this, I want to move forward, but your experience in the Marine Corps, How many of your direct leaders were 25, 30, 40 years older than you?
Yeah, not many. The
That's and I want to put on that point because something you shared is the military, the Marine Corps specifically, had to evolve quickly.
Yes,
And I
definitely.
think that evolution was quick because the proximity and age. I mean, you could have a like one of my good friends is a lieutenant colonel with the Marine Corps. He's in Japan and he's 45. So he's one of the top. Is just about to a general. They, a CEO executive, and yet he leads a lot of people that are much, much younger than him. And I think in our organizations today, when I step out of the military into whatever else, we don't necessarily see that. So that dynamic, that shrink, that, oh, we have to learn and get better quickly, or we're going to lose them, is just now facing organizations. All
Very
right, I
true.
made a big point on that. I want you to just run with it, however
Oh,
your
it's
thoughts are.
100% true. So, like in the military, if you do 20 years, you reach retirement age, you might stay in until for 30 years. You're not allowed to stay in much longer than that in most branches. So there's this automatic sort of turnover that takes place, and you go get different jobs and you have a different relationship with your service. But what you're going to see, exactly what you pointed out, Tyler, is going to continue to happen because now we think about it, we're living longer than ever. Longevity is off the charts. But who can afford to retire and live indefinitely? The answer is not many. So we're seeing that baby boomers, as an example, one of the more senior generations in our workforce, many of them have tried to retire, but realize like it's expensive out there. So they come back. And that's why I call them baby boomerangs
Yeah.
because they come back to the workforce. And so if you're a CEO and you're like, I've got a good life, I can live a much longer, you're not going to give up that position. You're going to continue to run it. That with every passing year, as younger and younger people come into your organization, if you don't evolve your thinking and you don't evolve your approach, you're even more out of step with what it takes to inspire and to motivate tomorrow's generation of leader, to build the type of organizations that young people in particular, and post-pandemic people, by the way, want to work at. So I feel like you're exactly right. There's this natural sort of process that takes place in the military that doesn't necessarily take place in the civilian world, and it's only going to continue to run against what needs to happen if we stay stuck in our thinking and stuck in our ways.
One of the pieces, and I shared this with a friend we were talking about a few weeks ago, is that the generational change, which you just mentioned, has forced the dynamic of today. If we stop, for example, baby boomers was this very large group of workers. They came in, they really kind of changed the workforce. When they entered the workforce in the 60s and in the 70s, we can think about all the social upheaval at that time, right? My parents tell me, I just imagine, watch. And we didn't really see that, our generation, Gen X, but now we've seen that a little bit with the millennials and now Gen Z, a much larger group. And they're kind of saying, hey, we have the power to say either change or you don't get us. And I think that dynamic really ties into something that you wrote about in your book, Expand the Circle, the killer bees. And I think the younger, the millennial, the Gen Z are forcing upon really workplaces to say, hey, the killer bees, and I'll let you describe all of that, is much more important than anything else you realize because we're looking for something different than you were, the baby boomer generation of 50, 60 years ago.
Completely. And when I wrote about the killer bees, it was something that I really discovered across post-pandemic workers, but in particular, as you point out, with millennial and later Gen Z. And the three Bs that I talk about is being, belonging, something bigger than myself. Those are the three things that we really are finding now in a more evolved way we want from work. And back, 20 years ago, we didn't ask or expect those things of work so much. But now when you think about being, it's like, who am I really? How do I discover myself and my strengths and my values and live them out through my work? Belonging. Who am I working with? How do I feel that strong social tie, that I feel this sense of camaraderie, for example? And then finally, something bigger than myself, when we get into areas of purpose and significance and meaning and mattering, these things are no longer optional for top talent who's saying like, I'm exchanging my life energy for what? I want to be working at a place that is honoring that I feel good about. And so I like to think a lot of times about how consumer has changed their perspective and who they shop with. For example, we don't want to buy from companies that are polluting the planet or that don't have a great social record. Well, the same is, to your point, happening on the employment side of things too. And top talent always has a choice. So that's why if I feel that all things being equal, if the pay packages are similar, the work format is similar, the amount of autonomy I can have in a job is similar, I'm going to go with that opportunity that makes me feel great about myself and about the people I'm working with and that I'm making a difference. That's the offer that's going to win out.
What do you think's been the biggest catalyst to drive that?
The pandemic was a big one. I think it led a lot of us, myself included, to juggle our priorities and our values and really examine not how do I want to approach my work, but what role do I even want work to play in my life? And that has really gone unabated. We have had some resistance in the form of some economic headwinds that tightened up the labor market, but there are certain industries where we're still seeing widespread talent shortages, and employers are having to really reconcile and change their approach if they want to land top talent. And so I think that was a huge one. Also, I think that Gen Z listened to their parents and said, follow your bliss, perhaps, don't work a job that's kind of hollow and meaningless like mine, but, do something that you're excited about. And we raised a generation on social media and with the ability to ask questions all the time and look up any answer in just a couple seconds. So it's not surprising that they brought some of those expectations with them into the workforce. And they ask really smart questions in my experience. Gen Z leaders say, why do we have all this technology if we're just going to work ourselves to death? And Gen X people like myself are like, what? What are you talking about? That's how it works.
What do you
And you're
mean?
like,
That's
no.
what work is. I mean,
Exactly. And they're like, no, that's not what work's going to be for us. We want work-life integration. We want to, have opportunities to take care of ourselves in addition to taking care. And it's not that they don't want to work hard. It's just that they want there to be a measured kind of a balanced approach to that. And when you look at the transcript, you're like, well, how come that seems unreasonable? We have, millennia of evolution when it comes to how we know what we know about work. How come we haven't figured it out? And instead, it's some of those old belief systems that really hold us back. When we have these outdated models, that becomes the problem.
You mentioned earlier this idea of, a lot of the baby boomers or now the older Gen X that are entering retirement age, and one of the things that I saw my parents is that early 2000s, going through 2008 financial crisis, early in my career, and as much as I struggled through it, what I saw is there were people that were maybe at that point like, all right, I'm 3, 4, 5 years from retirement, lost half of what they had. And then they had to rethink the entire thing. Or we saw pensions go away. We saw, absolute, I would say, corporate restructuring where they couldn't allow for people to retire early or at, 62 to 65. And people also, I think, realized that, oh, all my friends that retired, they're maybe a few years older than me, they're miserable. They died because they have nothing to work for. And so I think all of those factors kind of playing together has extended out the work career of people. But I also believe it's maybe informed like the millennials, Gen Z, myself to say, yeah, one, I'm not looking to retire from something because I'm miserable and I want to go enjoy life. I'd rather live life and enjoy it. And number two is there's no guarantee on whatever I put away or invest in a company as an employee that anything's going to be there when I retire. Do you think that is factored into all of this as well?
Completely. Because I think that what you're finding is that everyone's having a very individualized experience when it comes to why they work. And so I was in the grocery store the other day. I was checking out, and there was an older person who was handling my checkout. And I said, if you don't mind me asking, what is it that makes you choose to work here, in this grocery store doing checkout? And said, well, I live on a fixed income. And if I want to buy a new iPad, I don't want to feel bad about it. And I thought, boy, that's that's a response I hadn't expected. But that was an example of an economic reality for that person. We'll go to the other spectrum side and talk about Gen Z, and they say, well, my student loan is high, rents are high, I need to make a wage, like all these types of things. So what I want you to do, Tyler, is project for yourself, think about a millennial manager, maybe one of these elder millennials, and you're in a management position, and you have Gen Z people on your team, and you have Gen X people on your team. You have boomers who are in the office part-time because they don't want to work full-time because they could have retired, but they chose not to, and they still have specialized knowledge. And you even have outsourced or gig or contract workers. And you're sitting on top of all this going, oh my gosh, how in the world am I supposed to lead in this context? And that's where we really see a very individualized, personalized That more enlightened approach is all about realizing the paradox of leadership. Number one, it's not about you, right? You can't bring your ego into this. It's all about the mission, and it's about those people who are working with you to make the mission a reality. So that's why when you double down on those things, it's the only way, in my opinion, to survive sort of all of this individualized attention that's coming onto these teams and that's gumming up the works when we use these outdated models.
You wrote about enlightened leadership. You've referenced it several times. Would you define for myself, the audience, those listening, watching, what enlightened leadership is?
Yeah, it's really this willingness to throw off these outdated attitudes and beliefs that are holding us back. When you think about the original age of enlightenment, right? There was a time when we were investing in science and new ideas and everything was fresh and there was this curiosity and we were honoring it by just an explosion of creativity. That has not happened in leadership. So this notion that we can move beyond what has served us well in the past, perhaps, to embrace something that's new, that is a more enlightened view. And if you think about from a more philosophical perspective, it's really this understanding that there's a certain type of wisdom that I feel that we're lacking. When we look at work very transactionally as opposed to transformationally, then we find ourselves having a hollow experience. People don't want to just have a job. And now that you see these things like artificial intelligence taking over and restructuring roles, anytime we take a transactional approach, we create distance between ourselves and our people. So I feel like this is another dimension of what it means to take an enlightened approach where we keep score differently. It's not just about profit and productivity, although those things are absolutely important. We also have to recognize that the way we do our work has an impact on the welfare of our people and even on things that are beyond the bounds of the organization itself. To all of our stakeholders, that's a much more enlightened way of approaching the things that we need to be doing.
Because I'm Enneagram 8 challenger, but we're in complete agreement, but I want to push back a little bit when you say outdated. Because the reality is you've written about from your study of Buddhism and the ancient writings there and the wisdom there. If myself, I look to Christian writings and what Jesus and what so many people wrote about, which are complete lockstep. And it's almost that we forgot about those, and it is going back to those such human people-centric principles that for some reason technology forced us out of. So talk a little bit more about that. Why do we as a modern society kind of almost shirk some of those ancient writings? I mean, you compare Hinduism to Buddhism to Christianity to even Islam. A lot of those religious, spiritual, I would say, directives all are very much in line in regard to understanding ourselves to be able to be of service to others. So why do we dismiss those age-old insights and kind of want to go against them in our society?
Yeah, I think there's this move towards the modern life and the modern world. There's a lot of stimulation. There's a lot of things vying for our attention. And it's very easy for us to get into this kind of doom scroll. Netflix, as soon as one show is done, it says your next one starts in 3 seconds. You're like, okay, I guess we'll just let it roll. And there's this pulling apart, and it's almost like we're in more isolation than ever. If you go back not that long ago, when you think about the religious institutions were much more popular than they are today. We've seen a real decline. Your family might have lived next door, or at least in the same town. Now they live halfway across the country. If you think about your community, well, now we kind of stay isolated and we don't even talk to our neighbors that much. So a lot of the institutions of the past that were more in line with those spiritual or other types of ideals have really fallen away in terms of a more technological, isolating environment. And we're seeing that the levels of loneliness are off the charts. The Surgeon General in the US declared an epidemic of loneliness. And so I feel like you're exactly right, Tyler. In order to navigate and survive and certainly thrive and flourish in our modern times, we don't have to give up all the technology, all the modern conveniences. We don't have to go to a meditation cave and retreat and all this stuff. But we do have to get back to nature, get back to those types of things that are connected to the ideals that you shared. And in a religious pluralist sense, I agree with you. All the traditions, these ancient wisdom traditions, there's a thread that runs through them all. And it is not a me thread. It's about solitude. It's about connection. It's about back to those killer bees is a big part of it, I think. So I'm excited about the possibility, but I think it's clear that when we don't have those things in our lives, we have those existential questions, even though the ways that we used to get them addressed have really changed. That's kind of one way to look at it.
One thing that that's near and dear to me, and you can't quite see it. You can't see it in the studio. You can't see it because all the snow and the windows in the background. What's important to me is being close to the earth. I grew up on a farm. I enjoy that. I understand and appreciate so much value that it taught me, not only caring for animals, but seeing the change in seasons and keeping that from being in such a rat race that we forget about just the normal evolutions of life. And one thing that I'm seeing, I imagine you're seeing this, you're talking to people, it's not hard to recognize whether it's popular TV shows, as you mentioned, that now reflect on a simpler kind of life where, you have popular influencers are like, man, we're going to homesteads. We're going to go to farming. We're going to choose times to be out in the earth, like as it's called nature, right? For me, it's just called being outside. It's where I live. That's what it is. But one thing that I recognize there, and I've seen this for me, and I'd love for you to kind of reflect on it, is that drives you to become more aware of who you are and how you fit into the earth, as opposed to thinking I'm just a cog that needs to continue to do more in order to have value, purpose.
Yeah, and I think it really comes down to connection. When you feel
Yeah.
disconnected from the natural environment and everything's very artificial and sterile, then you lose something. And I think that there's this real push, as you mentioned, to get back to nature, back to our roots, to have those genuine experiences. And scientifically speaking, there's something fundamentally different that happens in your brain when you have that connection with nature. There's very much in your body. A lot of times, people have shifted their diets now to eat, eat localized foods or eat seasonal foods and something that's a little bit more sort of primal, if you will, because of the nature of how that connection is there. And I think that we saw something similar happen when it comes to, for example, even in our technology, when it comes to video, it's all about authenticity, right? We want the less polished videos because otherwise we don't trust them. I think there's a hunger for authentic experiences, and people are starting to spend a lot of money on experiences as opposed to things. And there's a movement towards essentialism and minimalism and these things because we feel like when life is so engineered and so technical and a little bit more sterile, we feel a sense of loss, I think. So rather, have coffee with a friend, walking around the block and taking in nature, like it's a restorative activity, and it's good for reducing stress and improving vitality. These aren't coincidental things. And to your earlier point, ancient wisdom has always held that connection needs to be there.
So where do you see it in your work as you are interacting with people? There's a push from leaders for greater efficiency. We got to make more with less because our shareholders, whatever, demands that. And this idea of what we just talked about is like, hey, slow is fast. Slow down and see, be able to see the sunrise, the sunset, to just take it all. Where do you see this conflict and how are people managing it?
Yeah, not well. I think there's this really
Just be blunt with me, all right, man?
yeah, I mean,
No, they suck.
well, unfortunately, there's this real compelling pull towards a mechanistic approach to business.
Mm.
When you think about what we teach in our business schools, we teach all about technology and strategy operations, and we hardly ever get to the people part because there's so much of a focus on the mechanics of business, which I think it makes some sense. But I think it fails to recognize the fact that every business is a people business. And so if you want to boost productivity, you want to have efficiencies, it's going to take people to make that possible. If your people are sick, if they're calling out, absenteeism's on the rise, they're disengaged, they're not going to have the energy to pour into making things more efficient, to have the innovative, the collaborative nature to make the organization run better. And I feel like there's this, most of the time, what I'm doing with executive teams in particular is helping demonstrate the vastly interconnected nature of organizations that are really made up of people. They're not made up just of machinery or org charts or all this other stuff. It's really about the connection of your people. And so what we find is that what I call a production system is really dependent on the people system. And the people system is dependent on the purpose system. So when people feel connected in some of the things we talked about earlier, meaning and significance and purpose, then they have the vital energy to be able to be kind to one another, to be supportive of one another, collaborative, all these things. And when those things happen, then productivity improves as well. So there's this connection from top to bottom. And in order to realize the next level of productivity and the next level of engagement and wellness and all these things, we have to make sure that there are no gaps. But when we allow gaps to set in and we start treating people like machines, or we start putting an undue focus on the bottom line, we actually inevitably make things worse. And all of a sudden, productivity goes down because turnover goes up. All of a sudden now we can't be efficient because we're constantly retraining on that hamster wheel. So it's like, call timeout, to your point. Slow is fast, stop for a second. And let's be clear that if the goal is a production level goal, that's fine. We need to have profitable businesses or we'll be out of business. But we also have to recognize that we can only get there by helping people feel a sense of purpose and to make those connections with one another.
You wrote about this in your book. You've kind of alluded to it a little bit. Again, the pandemic drove a lot of people to just say, whoa, what's going on? What drove you yourself to this point of like, man, I can't keep operating this way? What drove you to be such a, I would say, evangelist for a enlightened and inspired, a humanistic style of leadership?
Yeah, I would say personally, it started with experience. I was the guy that never felt complete. Raging imposter syndrome, insecure overachiever, like you read about. So I piled on achievement after achievement. Marines wasn't good enough, had to be an Ironman, PhD level, all these things. And it was like shoveling achievements into a bottomless hole, Tyler. There was just no end to it. There was nothing I could accomplish that was going to make me feel like it was all going to be okay. It was just a losing game because the whole construct that I had set up and that is set up for so many of us who feel this way, and I'm sure there's people listening that are like, oh yeah, I'm there now. And it's understandable how we end up in that place. But what happened during the pandemic in particular, it was like my legs were cut out from underneath me. And I was just found myself in free fall. And things that had worked all too well stopped working. And as I'm falling and I'm trying to have these existential questions for myself answered, it was almost like I didn't woke up and didn't even recognize myself. I fortunately landed on a meditation cushion. And I started to pick up my studies of these ancient Eastern philosophies. And the reality, Tyler, is I'm terrible at meditating. So all I can think about is work. And the connections that I was making was really seeing how some of those ideals that you talked about earlier are absolutely showing up for us in our workers. Thinking about, what is it that I can do to have an impact? How do I feel my strongest, most authentic self? How do I get my existential questions answered? And work hasn't kept up. So for me, it was really trying to decide for myself, like, should I go on this journey and take a look at the research? And what I found was study after study after study. Again, as a Western trained psychology researcher, I'm looking for the evidence. And the evidence shows that when we experience connection, when we have levels of psychological safety and trust and followership and servant leadership and all these types of things, the work gets better. It's undeniable. What prevents us from getting those things at work, though, however, is something that is all too predictable, and it's fear. Fear destroys everything good in organizations and in relationships. And so the overcoming that fear was a journey that I continue on, to this day.
What I love is cool is two things, and I'll share this just anecdotally for the fact of it. The first one is, in my background as a nutritionist for dairy cows and working on dairies, is we would always say that every problem was a two-legged problem. And yet in that industry, it still is the case. If I go back to my entire, career in college, very little ever was focused on solving those two-legged problems. Everything was centralized on a spreadsheet or the four-legged problems. It was never about how do you and I interact better? How do I diffuse my fears? How do I understand my insecurity? None of that was ever discovered. At the same point, this was really cool, and this is just a matter of conversation. I was looking through your entire podcast history, and I know one person. Over 100, I think 111. So there's one common. That's it. Okay. I think that's really cool because as I read your book, as you just shared right there, whether you realize it or not, how aligned our experiences are, that I believe the absolute factor that is limiting so many organizations in so many fields of study from really getting to what's important is their fear and insecurity, and how those insecurities and fears are manifested. And we get away from the, hey, I don't want to have to talk about the people problems because I'm not sure who I am and how I am. I have yet to fall onto that mat, that proverbial mat, and find out more about myself so I can work with others. It's easier to say, hey, I need a 3% higher efficiency. You need to go cut 5% of costs. That's what's going to fix the problems. Like, that'll never fix any problems, in my opinion. It only makes the problems worse.
So well said. And it's when you think about it in that way, you're just doing a different set of calculus when you only focus on the 3%, the 4%. When you realize if you take one of these, any of these traditions you talked about earlier, and how we see the level of selflessness, the level of connectedness that is what life is really about, which means that business is really about, because business is life, then we start to keep score differently. And the calculus we do starts to say, sure, I'm making a ton of money, but what is the condition of my people when I send them home to their families and to their communities? And we're seeing more and more examples of these enlightened organizations, again, to use my term, when you start to see the way that they are looking at their businesses as vehicles for doing something good in the world beyond just make money. Yes, they're making money, but also they're reinvesting in their workforce. They're helping them self-organize to be able to pursue charitable activities in their own communities. They're using business as a force to create the kind of world that they want. And the workers who are saying, I want to be a part of this, they don't turn over, right? You want to talk about productivity and getting that 3, 4, 5%, keep your workers, keep them excited, keep the energy pouring in, and be willing to share some of that output in a way that makes the entire flywheel spin. That is possible, but it requires an entirely new way of thinking about our opportunity, if not our responsibility as leaders, to change the rules of the game.
A thought just hit me. It's not in my notes. I will tie this in. I had a conversation with someone just over the weekend, and I would say a part of that, the older extreme of a generation. And I think a generation that really has not come to grips, for the most part. There are some people, there's always exceptions, that it's about people. And even though they're people centric, it's this idea of people. And they asked me, said, Tyler, there's so many books about leadership, but there's no books about being a good employee. If they were to ask you that, what would you say?
Well, I think that a lot of times we have a misnomer that leaders are the more senior people in organizations. They have the big lofty titles. I've always looked at myself as a leader, even when I was an individual contributor. Even though I was fresh out of the service, they taught me that you're a leader. You may lead your projects, you may comport yourself with your coworkers, but to me, leadership is absolutely something that needs to be present at every level. So I think that the proper leadership training is employee training if every employee sees themselves as a leader. Now, their span of control is different. Their opportunity to make the big investment decisions is different, but the responsibility to act like a leader isn't. The responsibility to face your fears and to recognize where it's sullying the relationship you have with your coworkers, where it's making gaps in our lines where we need there to be tightness. Yeah. That's absolutely possible for employees. And I think that one of the reasons I wrote the book the way I did was because I wanted any worker at any level to be able to go through the exercises and understand where they have an enlightened view already, but where they might have an opportunity to see things and do the work to approach it a little bit differently.
You have kind of part of your framework is lead yourself, lead others, lead your team, lead your organization, lead the world. I think that flow chart comes back to what I said, is that here's part of that is there's no books about how to be a good employee, because the reality is every great employee leads themselves first. And so if you start to practice that, and it's, man, would you much rather have an employee that's all they're ever going to be, or you'll have someone that is leading themselves, and they're leading themselves and growing your organization, because that's what leadership is. It's not this idea of a managerial title, whatever else. It is, can you lead yourself? And by that, you're going to force everyone around you, not by force of, will, but force of I'm performing better, I'm helping others perform better, that we're all going to get better. And what I really took from that, and again, you so masterfully said it, is that, and again, coming back to, if you're leading yourself, there's a place in everywhere, in everything, as opposed to this mindset or difference is like, oh, there's a flip of the switch when all of a sudden you become a leader. Like, it doesn't happen that way ever. And if we rely on that, that's why we have the problems we have, because you just want to, if you're coming at it from a different point of view, it's like, why aren't they just being good employees? Then you are saying, I am creating a condition where all they see in themselves is I'm here to just check in, check out. And people don't want to be a part of that.
No, no. And I think when you take that framework, for example, and we say we have to lead from the inside out, that's where we take action, for myself, and then maybe with one other person, maybe with a team. But the aspiration works from the outside in. So I want the world to be happy and healthy. I want my organization to be healthy before myself, before my own needs are met. That's the most enlightened viewpoint. But let's stick at the level of a team. Let's say you're the most junior team member on a team, and you want your team to be not just productive, but you want it to be also a happy, tight, people enjoying one another's company and collaboration. You're the most junior member on the team. And somebody makes a point in the meeting, and you say, I think Sarah made a really great point. I really appreciate that she called that out. That's a leadership action, because what happens? Now all of a sudden, Sarah feels a little bit better that even though you're a junior team member, you've basically acknowledged something positive. You've helped the group feel like we're making good progress. The fact that you weren't the boss doesn't mean that you don't have an opportunity to act like a leader in that moment. And so I think this is the choice that we all have with every interaction that we have is, do we want to show up as leaders, or do we want to show up for ourselves? To me, those are two entirely different things. I think leadership done at its best recognizes and reconciles that paradox. It's not about you when it comes to aspiration, but it's all about you when it comes to taking action. If you can overcome that little riddle, you're well on your way to being the type of enlightened leader, regardless of what your pay grade or your title or the number of people in your organization or anything like that. If more people were able to do that, then all of a sudden, the fundamental nature of how we approach business would change.
You mentioned this at the very beginning, this idea that, I don't want to say we're going about it the wrong way, but we're going about it the wrong way. In concept of how we identify, oh, that's a strong organization. They had great returns. I even think, as I'm trying to conceptualize this in a question comment, is going back to Good to Great, Jim Collins. And Jim Collins didn't look at organizations that had the greatest, employee retention, engagement, any of those. He looked at one factor. And again, by his study, I can only look at one factor. I try to put in too much noise, man, I'll get lost in the dust. And yet he found that there was this quotient of the leaders of those 11 companies were different. And they were different at a time when everyone else was trying to play a playbook of just the grind. And what's interesting is you look now 20 some years later after that book and after that study of the companies that have continued to excel and the ones that haven't. And it really kind of makes you rethink. It's like, have we learned anything in that 20 years that really was going back 30, 40 years? Or are we still stuck in the way it was done? And the idea is, if we just continue to grind, we'll get the results that we want to from the past.
Yeah.
So just give me your feeling on, as I share that and as you think through that, or how you've interacted with organizations maybe in the same light.
Yeah, I think there are some timeless principles that always make sense. And I enjoyed that book too. And I feel like when it comes to things like transparency, making sure that we're always investing in skills, Jim would say, we got to get the right people on the bus. Yeah, if you get the wrong people on the bus, it's not going to work. But where's the bus headed? The reality is that things have really changed when it comes to the nature of the types of organizations people want to work for. I'll give you an example real quick, is that historically, You didn't have much choice but to work a traditional job. Well, now what we do, like when I talk to healthcare CEOs, they say, what young person wants to make 14 bucks an hour or minimum wage to work with sick people when they can set their own hours with Instacart and DoorDash and all these types of things? Like we're having a hard time. We're shutting down hospital services because we can't get non-clinical staff to take these jobs. Whoa, like that wasn't happening back when Good to Great came out. So there's this entire new shadow economy of gig workers who are saying they're making me return to office. I'll just hang up my shingle and I'll work as a freelancer because it's more viable than ever to do that. So when you're competing with the world's economy, not just your own local talent pool in order to get the labor you need to power your business, things have really changed. And you're seeing companies explode onto the scene now that can become really successful really quickly. And on a smaller level, you can see influencers who start businesses that can be very successful very quickly too. All everything's constantly evolving. Nothing is fixed and permanent. So, with all due respect to Jim, I think there's timeless principles in his book, and I think there's some things that have wholly changed in the time since he wrote it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is it comes back to this generational shift. It comes back to this, why are we doing what we're doing? And I think what can be real difficult for leaders is to say, like the healthcare situation is people don't want to do this. Honestly, I disagree with that. There are people that do want to do it because it fits their internal purpose. They get to serve something bigger. They get to be a part of a team, because I know plenty of people that do gig work that honestly end up miserable because they don't like being alone, and they're just kind of it's a constant merry-go-round. They're like, am I actually making a difference? And I think what's important there, and this is the day and age of leaders to really lead, is to express a vision to people. This is what we're doing, and this is why it's important. And then I believe to come alongside them, connect with them, show them empathy, compassion, say, I care about you, and I see the value you have into this organization. Now let's go make it happen. I think that can happen, and people are yearning for that. And that's going to be the draw away from just some of the holy gig work that doesn't fulfill that interpersonal need.
I think it's so well said. And so think about, in my terms, where we start with the purpose system, you're saying I get to help people heal. That feels very good to me. At the same time, then you go down to the people system. You're like, however, my boss is a jerk. My coworkers are all grumpy. There's a lot of politics on my floor. Like all of a sudden, all that good purpose just completely got drained. And the person's like, you know what? I just don't know if it's worth it. I had somebody taking my blood the other day. She said, I love taking people's blood, but I'm thinking about driving for DoorDash because my boss is a jerk, and there's all these types of challenges. Not fun place to work. And so all of a sudden, her sense of purpose was being challenged. So there's no way, if you don't make it through the purpose system and the people system, that production system, whether you're in healthcare, manufacturing, whatever, just whatever it is you're trying to produce, is going to have enough energy left in it to turn out really well. And the problem is that these things are so interconnected that it becomes really hard. It's hard to be a player on a losing ball team. And so all of a sudden, when the environment gets toxic, it gets very depersonalized. Big companies get like this sometimes. Then all of a sudden, it challenges the people system, and certainly the purpose system in that case.
As we wrap up here and as we think about our time, what's one powerful practice, regardless of beliefs or alignment, what's one practical purpose you think that you could give leaders and they should immediately implement?
I would say a pause button. Can we just
I
hit
love it.
pause for a second?
Yeah.
The power of reflection, the power of taking yourself offline, so to speak, whatever that means for you. It could just be taking a walk in the woods by yourself, whatever it is, and just slow down the thoughts in your mind enough to reflect on what really matters, what you're really all about, how you're really doing. We are in this environment where it's so go all the time that we don't have time to let the lessons really sink in. We don't have time to listen, to that part of us and what's really going on. And so I feel like every night, for example, I have a practice where I think back about the day and I go through, what actions did I take? What am I grateful for? And what intentions do I have for tomorrow? I've been doing that for a long time. And I got to tell you, Tyler, it's a game changer, because what happens is your entire mindset right before you go to sleep. My morning stack is the opposite, where it's about reflection, study, proper meditation, formal stuff, because I have the energy to do it then. So my point simply is that if you could hit the pause button, whatever time of day, whatever format, doesn't matter, but just call time out, check in with yourself, reflect on the lessons, and use that opportunity to commit to becoming the leader that you wish to become and try to figure out what that looks like, oh man, that would be my gift.
Here's what's funny about that. And man, if I were to stop and say the most often the difficulty is that pause. Yes, I agree with it wholeheartedly. It's think. Think. Yeah, I can imagine just writing a book or having an app and it's just think. That's it. Get off your calendar. Don't do back-to-backs. Don't do the think. What's fun, part of my community, we've reading a book. It's called Reconnected by Carlos Whitaker. Came out last fall, and he went to got away from screens for 7.5 weeks. Not sure if you're familiar with the book at all. Went to a monastery, was there for a couple weeks, went to an Amish farm, was there for a couple weeks, went home for a few weeks, totally off screens. And one of the biggest things I've been walking through that with my leadership community is this reality to say, hey, break the system you've been in because it's giving you the results and you feel this tension, you feel this anxiety. That's why. So just put a pause, just think. I've been doing this, I would say, 75-day system of working out, whatever else. I won't give it a name because the person doesn't deserve it, but that's all right. And what I have gathered from that is just the practice of I'm going to go for a 45-minute walk outside, and I work outside, taking care of animals, but just that time that, yeah, I can listen to a book. I could even listen to music, but I can look around at my neighborhood. Man, I've thoroughly enjoyed it because I can have the time to set aside, walk with my dog and, whatever else, watch her play in the snow. It's fun, but it forces me to think. And I appreciate what you're sharing there because I think so many leaders feel guilty in the fact I can't put that on my calendar, just time to think, because my superior, other people will imagine I'm not working.
Right. So true. And we forget why we're paid to do what we do. We forget why we're asked to do what we do. And without thinking, I think that's really becoming a lot of what's left. When we start to see how much generative AI is doing and other types of arrangements, we're creating so much efficiencies in our businesses. Thinking is the best part. And so why feel guilty about the part that only we can do in favor of things that we're doing that really something else or someone else should be doing? That's not leadership at all.
No. And it's really that I think part of this is being human to say, hey, you can't possibly drive a car without ever getting it serviced, without ever getting new tires. Like you can't do million-mile vehicles without tires and an oil change, without, stopping to get electric charge or fuel. You have to do that. And it comes back to some of the things that you've spoken about, the wellness piece of it. It's like, man, that has to be a part of our organizations.
Yeah.
Matt, as we wrap up, where can people learn more about you, your work, everything that you're doing?
Huge on LinkedIn. I love being on LinkedIn. So that's a great place to follow me, connect with me there. MattPoepsel.com if you want to just check out some of the things on my website. You're certainly welcome to do that. And you mentioned podcast. Lead the People is a podcast that I run and enjoy doing that as well. So lots of different ways to always sharing insights. Like you, I'm an essayist in the sense of just I have experiences in the world that I think relate to leadership and might be helpful from time to time. I share them as often as I can. And really, it's one of my greatest joys in life right now. Anything we can do to help people lead at the next level and start to reduce some of the suffering that we're creating inadvertently while pursuing efficient and effective business. Yeah, that's the good stuff to me.
Love it. Well, thank you for being here. For all of you that are watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button as well as the bell so you're notified whenever we drop new content. If you're listening, wherever you listen to podcasts, whether it's Apple Podcast, Spotify, whatever else, if you could rate or review this episode, that will make sure more people will be able to find impactful leaders like Matt. Until next time, thanks for being here and choose to lead with impact.